Hello, this is Harold Monroe, editor-in-chief at the Vancouver Sun and Province, and joining me is Katie DeRosa from the Legislative Bureau in Victoria, our legislative reporter. Hi, Katie.
Hi, Harold. Nice to be chatting with you.
Yes, back for another week. You wrote last week about how two women MLA from opposite political parties were facing a barrage of death and sexual assault threats, and so they joined forces to identify their abusers. Can you tell us more about that story?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was an example of a small snippet of some of the online abuse and harassment that women politicians get, and unfortunately, it ramped up to a point where both Selena Robinson, who's the Minister for Post-Secondary Education, and Eleanor Sturckow, who's the BC United critic for mental health, they were both receiving very similar emails that were way beyond just disagreeing with their policies. They were full-on death threats, very aggressive, and so they both reported the emails to the legislative services, and from that they realized they were both getting similar emails. And actually, I talked to the sergeant at arms told me that it was actually 9 MLAs and 5 staff who were getting emails from who believed to be the same person. And so Selena Robinson and Eleanor Sturckow reported the incident to the police. They made sure, because Eleanor Sturckow was a former RCMP officer, she made sure the files were linked, really pushed to make sure the file was taken seriously, because what Minister Robinson raised was she was concerned that online threats are still not treated as seriously as a death threat or someone physically knocking on your door or someone coming to your constituency office. So, she felt like they really needed to push for both police and the legislative services, protective services here at the Ledge, to take it seriously. So basically, it was months and months. They finally got the person's name and a photo, just so that they can be aware if this person went from online threats to in person. Minister Robinson said she was nervous, and Eleanor Sturckow as well. They were nervous being out in public because they didn't know who was behind this. And so the person has been arrested, but the investigation is ongoing, so no charges. There was feedback to them that the person was had severe mental health issues, so of course that's a factor for police. But I think it raised the awareness as well of how politicians can work across parties. Like, they both said that this is an issue that is nonpartisan. They put aside whatever disagreements they might have during question period and really try to have a united front to deal with these threats.
Well, and this is becoming a problem. I mean, even for female journalists like yourself, for racialized people and journalists and politicians, it's really becoming a problem. Is there anything that can be done within the walls of the legislature to provide greater protection, or does it need to be done?
Well, the Sergeant at Arms, Ray Robitel, who I spoke to, he said that they have increased their their digital screen for being able to pull emails that might be threatening. He said they've seen a huge spike in such emails being directed at MLAs. So the pandemic was a big factor. So when they were getting in about 2019 about 120 such either threatening or aggressive emails, that number has spiked up to in the 600s just so far this year. So we're not even at the end of the year. So I think legislative services, they said that they are increasing again their screens to be able to catch this. But again, a lot of this goes to federal responsibility, maybe regulations around some of these social media platforms like Twitter, like Facebook. They kind of need to also step up and do a bit more to perhaps crack down on these online threats, which will often come through social media. So I think it sounds like we're really still catching up to these threats, and really again not taking them as seriously as we would in-person threats. And it seems like that's changing, but quite slowly.
Right. Oh, you mentioned that Sturckow and Robinson work together on this across party lines. You see them every day away from question period when they do go out at each other, again, policy wise, not personality wise. But how do you find the those across the political spectrum, how do they get along away from the legislative battles?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends who it is. I mean, there might be some politicians who have quite a grudge against each other, and they might not be as friendly. And especially if something recent had happened where they were trading jabs, and sometimes in question period, it unfortunately does cross to the personal. Usually, they try and keep it fairly policy based, but we have seen people lose their temper and say things that. But I think outside of question period, a lot of MLAs will say, we talk about policies. I mean, Sonia Furstenau has talked about that with, talking to other MLAs and how they really can form a strong coalition sometimes about some issues, even being on committees. There was a committee on improving the drug policy and mental health policy, and Nikki Sharma was leading that, and it really was quite united across all parties on demanding, I guess, better mental health care. So, I do think there are times where we see a lot of cross-party cooperation, and again, that's not publicized as much because it's not as exciting of a news story if everyone's getting along. So I think the question period barbs get a bit more attention, but certainly there's a lot of of that cooperation going on.
Right. Well, sticking in the legislature, last week you told us about the Conservative Party gaining official party status when we saw a BC United MLA defect, Bruce Bannerman defect over to the Conservatives. So now we have 4 parties with official party status in the legislature, which is unusual, I believe. So what happens now as far as who gets the resources and who gets to speak during and ask questions during question period? What happened with that on Friday?
Yeah, so there was a Legislative Assembly Management Committee. So that's the committee that oversees the legislature's finances. And the question before the committee was, should the BC Conservatives get equal amount of funding for the leader's office as, say, the BC Greens? And so the parties that are not the official opposition, so obviously the BC United are the official opposition, the other parties get 50% of that leader's office budget. So that amounts to $340 something thousand a year. So at the before Friday, the BC Conservatives were not eligible for that because there was no mechanism for a fourth party. So now the language has been changed, not to say third party or fourth party, but any party that's not the official opposition will get that certain amount. And that is in addition to the set funding that is given for each MLA. So obviously the Conservatives and the Greens both have 2 MLAs, so they will get a amount of funding proportional to each MLA that they have. And also in question period now, when the legislature resumes in October, we will see the BC Conservatives be able to ask questions daily, just like the BC Greens. So official party status does give them quite a more of a platform.
So what are they able to do with that $340,000?
Basically, that's sort of their budget to hire staff. And then with staff comes more polished communications and, again, more ability to put themselves out there. So I really think that hiring the staff, even being able to do the research, sometimes, opposition parties file FOIs and they find the research that's going to make their opponents squirm a bit or not look great. So I think that's the kind of resources they can access now. Right.
And then, of course, we're about a year away from the next provincial election, and at this point, they probably would have a spot on the podium and in kind of a leaders' debate as well.
Yes, that's right. So likely that they'll have a platform at the leaders' debate, and again, that allows them to put out their platform to a larger audience. And we did see John Rustad get a little bit of a platform when there was the anti-SOGI, that's the anti-sexual orientation and gender identity. There was protests at the legislature, and on that day, he released his policy on how he feels about social inclusion policies in schools. And so that kind of raised a debate about, okay, here's the BC Conservatives really setting themselves apart with those policies.
Okay, interesting. I don't think Rustad was at the UBCM last week, the Union of BC Municipalities, but certainly all three of the other party leaders were there when the mayors and municipal councillors gathered in Vancouver for their annual convention. It's traditional, of course, for the premier to speak and for the cabinet ministers to hold court and hear from the concerns and aspirations of the local politicians. What did you hear from local leaders, or what kind of messaging was there for Eby and his friends?
Well, certainly a lot of the mayors were raising concerns about housing policies, and basically that they said, and Dan Fumano had an excellent column on this, that they are trying to build as much housing as possible, but the money for the infrastructure, schools and transit and hospitals is not keeping up with that pace. So there was about 24 people up at a podium for putting the pressure on both the federal government and the provincial government to increase transit funding, and then also during a Q&A with Minister Ravi Kahlon, Housing Minister Ravi Kahlon, quite a lot of pressure on the lack of infrastructure funding, again, to support those housing starts. Minister Kahlon sort of used kind of a common line, which is that they're pushing the federal government to tie housing funding to immigration, to acknowledge that BC is facing a record number of immigrants and newcomers coming, and that the housing needs to keep up with those, giving those people somewhere to live. It kind of ties to a joke that the premier made during his press conference on Friday, which he says, it was Friday, he said TGIF, which actually stands for Thank God It's Federal. So, his critics might say Eby is a lot of the times on crime, on housing, kind of pointing to the federal government. We saw that on health as well. So he made a joke, but I mean, there's truth to it, that maybe this is a strategy that provinces, especially BC, are kind of saying, okay, sure, we can do this, but we need the federal government to step up. So I think that the message from mayors was clear, but also the province was kind of using that the same line about, well, what about the feds? So if that's a distraction, we'll have to see.
Well, and it's a good point, but it's of course it's no joke for the local mayors and councillors who, if they're still three years away, I guess, from another election, but every project they approve that has community objections over concerns about transportation or schools or community centers, that's another knock against them that could hurt them at the polls next time. So they really do need to all get aligned on this if you're going to get buy-in from community.
Well, yeah, and again, one of the tensions is that the province has pointed the finger at municipalities, saying we want you to, or some municipalities, to approve a certain number of housing starts, housing targets, and if they don't do that, they could face, the province has the right to overrule them and could rezone areas, and so municipalities have kind of complained that they are the scapegoat, like the province is always pointing the finger at them, saying, well, you're the reason that more housing is not going to get built. And some municipalities are saying, that's not true. We're approving as fast as we can, but there are projects that are stalled because they haven't gotten funding from BC Housing. So it is really a bit of pointing fingers back and forth, saying who's not moving fast enough. And overall, I think people who are looking for a place to live just want to see the housing built. They don't really care who's to blame. They just want housing prices to come down.
Yes. All right, Katie, thank you. Look forward to our chat again next week.
Thanks, Harold. Nice to talk to you.